Imagine your daughter, sister, or niece coming home from school in tears after being humiliated by someone who was supposed to educate and protect her. That's exactly what happened to Sarah, a 10-year-old black girl who had her hair forcibly cut by her own teacher in front of the entire class. But wait, this story doesn't end here. The very next day, something unexpected happened that changed everything. What began as a brutal act of racism took a turn no one could have anticipated. In this video, you'll uncover the details of this incident that shook an entire community, understand the impact of racism in schools, and see how the courage of united individuals transformed pain into a powerful lesson in justice and solidarity. Stay tuned until the end, because the conclusion of this story will not only surprise you, but might just inspire you to make a difference. The town of San Rafael woke up slowly that Tuesday morning, its streets still cloaked in the quiet of dawn. The buzz of cicadas mingled with the faint hum of school buses crisscrossing the narrow roads. In the modest Johnson household, Sarah was tying the last of her braids, her mother Lila's skillful hands weaving the intricate pattern. "You're going to shine today, sweetheart," Lila said with a smile, securing the final braid with a small purple bead, Sarah's favorite color. Sarah admired her reflection, her heart swelling with pride. Her hair wasn't just a style. It was a piece of her identity, a testament to the culture her mother had always encouraged her to embrace. With her lunchbox in hand and a spring in her step, she headed to school, blissfully unaware of the storm that awaited her. At Westfield Elementary, the day began like any other. Children shuffled into classrooms, their chatter echoing through the halls. In room 6B, however, tension lingered just beneath the surface. Donna Claudia Hensley stood at the front, her posture rigid, her gaze sharp. She was dressed impeccably, her pressed blouse and pencil skirt emphasizing her reputation as a no-nonsense teacher. For years, Claudia had commanded respect, or rather, fear, from her students. But today, something in her demeanor felt different. Sarah took her usual seat near the window, her cheerful greeting met with a curt nod from Claudia. As the lesson began, Claudia moved briskly through the geography curriculum, pointing to a map of the United States. She spoke with clipped precision, her tone void of warmth. The students dutifully took notes, sensing her mood was unusually harsh. Midway through the lesson, Claudia paused. Her eyes narrowed as they landed on Sarah, whose head was slightly tilted, her braids catching the sunlight streaming through the window. Claudia's voice sliced through the air. "Sarah Johnson," she said, her tone sharp enough to make the girl flinch. "Do you really think that messy hair of yours belongs in this classroom?" The room fell deathly quiet. Every head turned toward Sarah, whose cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Her classmates exchanged uneasy glances, some fidgeting with their pencils, unsure how to react. Claudia's words hung in the air, heavy and cruel, like a storm cloud ready to burst. Sarah's voice caught in her throat as she attempted to respond. I thought it was fine, ma'am," she stammered, her voice barely audible. Claudia snorted, a mocking laugh escaping her lips. "Fine? That hair is a distraction. Come up here, Sarah. Let me show you what proper grooming looks like." A gasp rippled through the room. Sarah hesitated, frozen in her seat, her instincts urging her to stay put. But Claudia's stern gaze left no room for defiance. With trembling hands, Sarah stood and walked slowly to the front of the room, the eyes of her classmates following her every step. When Sarah reached the teacher's desk, Claudia opened her drawer and pulled out a pair of scissors. "Turn around," she ordered coldly. "Please, don't," Sarah began. But her words were cut off by Claudia's impatient gesture. Before anyone could intervene, Claudia grabbed a handful of Sarah's braids and, with a sickening snip, severed them. The sound of the scissors slicing through the hair echoed in the silent classroom. Strands of Sarah's beautiful braids fell to the floor, a stark contrast against the polished tiles. Sarah's eyes welled with tears as she reached up to touch her uneven hair. Her classmates sat in stunned silence, their expressions a mix of horror and disbelief. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what had just happened rendered them mute. Claudia, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of her actions, placed the scissors back in her drawer and said casually, "Now, Take your seat and focus on the lesson." But Sarah didn't move. Instead, she turned and bolted out of the room, her tears leaving a trail down her face. The sound of her sobs echoed faintly in the hallway as the classroom remained eerily still. Back in the classroom, Claudia resumed her lecture as though nothing had happened. But the damage was done. The silence was no longer respectful, it was suffocating. Even the students who usually idolized Claudia now exchanged uneasy glances, their loyalty wavering. In the hallway, Sarah leaned against a wall, her body shaking with sobs. She clutched the uneven ends of her hair, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Why had this happened? What had she done to deserve this? As she wiped her tears, Sarah's heart hardened with resolve. This wasn't the end. This couldn't be the end. Deep down, she knew someone would stand up for her, even if she had to find them herself. That evening, the Johnson household was a mix of anguish and rage. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, her shoulders slumped, her hands gripping a mug of cocoa that had long since gone cold. Her mother, Lila, paced the room, barely containing her fury. Mark, her father, sat across from Sarah, his hands clasped tightly, his face etched with worry. "She cut your hair? In front of everyone? What kind of person does that?" Lila finally exploded, her voice trembling with emotion. Sarah nodded silently, her fingers brushing the uneven ends of her hair. Each touch reignited the humiliation she had felt, the laughter she imagined still echoing in her ears. "This isn't just cruel. It's an attack," Mark said, his voice low but firm. "We have to do something about this, Lila." That night, after putting Sarah to bed, Mark and Lila sat down to draft a formal complaint. They listed every detail Sarah had recounted, every injustice she had suffered in that classroom. Lila's hands shook as she typed, her mind replaying her daughter's tear-streaked face. By the time they finished, their determination had hardened into steel. The next morning, they marched into Westfield Elementary, complaint in hand. The secretary at the front desk, a young woman with kind eyes, looked flustered as she tried to deflect their demands to see Principal Carter. "He's in a meeting," she said nervously. "Then pull him out," Lila snapped. "This is more important than whatever he's discussing." After a tense wait, Principal Carter emerged from his office. A man in his 50s with a neatly trimmed beard and a demeanor that exuded calm authority, Carter ushered them into his office. Once the door closed, however, his carefully curated calm began to crumble under the weight of Lila's righteous anger. "My daughter was humiliated, assaulted, and robbed of her dignity in your school. And you want to tell me it's just a misunderstanding?" Lila's voice shook with fury as she slammed the complaint on his desk. Carter sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Mrs. Johnson, I assure you, this school has zero tolerance for discrimination. I'll look into the matter personally." "That's not enough," Mark interjected. "We want immediate action. Claudia Hensley has no business teaching children." Carter's response was measured, almost rehearsed. "We must follow protocol. An investigation will be conducted, and appropriate steps will be taken." Lila leaned forward, her voice icy. "This isn't about protocol, it's about justice. If you don't take this seriously, I will make sure everyone in this town knows what happened in that classroom." Carter's calm facade faltered. "Please, let's not escalate this unnecessarily. We all want what's best for Sarah. Do you?" Lila shot back, her eyes blazing. "Because if you did, Claudia would already be out of a job." That evening, feeling stonewalled by the school administration, Lila turned to social media. She posted a photo of Sarah's uneven hair alongside a detailed account of the incident. The post began simply, "Yesterday, my 10-year-old daughter was humiliated in front of her classmates by someone who was supposed to protect and educate her. This is what happened." Within hours, the post exploded. Comments poured in, some offering support, others sharing similar experiences. The story struck a chord, sparking outrage and solidarity across the community. By morning, #StandWithSarah was trending locally, and calls for Claudia Hensley's dismissal grew louder. At school, Sarah hesitated as she approached the building. Her stomach churned with anxiety, her feet dragging as if each step brought her closer to another round of humiliation. But as she entered her classroom, she was greeted by something she hadn't expected: solidarity. The air in room 6B was charged with tension. Students whispered in small groups, their eyes darting towards Sarah's desk. A few brave classmates approached her, their voices filled with nervous support. "What she did was wrong, Sarah," said Mia, a quiet girl who rarely spoke up. "We're on your side." Across the room, Claudia sat stiffly at her desk, her face set in a mask of indifference. But beneath her composed exterior, she could feel the shift. The usual respect, or fear, that greeted her was absent. The students' collective defiance was palpable, and for the first time, Claudia felt a sliver of doubt. As the day progressed, it became clear that Claudia's authority was unraveling. Students whispered during her lessons, exchanged knowing glances, and some blatantly ignored her instructions. Even the quietest kids seemed emboldened, their solidarity with Sarah a silent rebellion. Outside the classroom, the Johnsons' fight gained momentum. Local activist groups reached out, offering legal advice and support. Community members began organizing a rally to demand accountability from the school. Flyers circulated with the rally's details, featuring slogans like, "Racism has no place here," and "Justice for Sarah." Lila received a call from a reporter at the local news station. "We'd like to cover your story," the reporter said. "It's clear this isn't just about one incident. It's about a culture that needs to change." Meanwhile, Claudia Hensley found herself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who once defended her now kept their distance, wary of being associated with the controversy. Parents began pulling their children from her class, and the principal's polite indifference toward her complaints only deepened her unease. Late one night, Claudia sat alone in her modest apartment, scrolling through the hundreds of comments under Lila's post. For the first time, she felt the weight of the storm she had unleashed. But rather than reflecting on her actions, she seethed with resentment, convinced she was the victim of an overreaction. The stage was set. A community on the brink of transformation, a family determined to fight, and a teacher clinging to a crumbling facade. The fallout from that Tuesday morning was only beginning, and the events to come would ripple far beyond the town of San Rafael. The morning after Lila's post went viral, the Johnson family woke up to a flood of notifications on their phones. Sarah, still hesitant to face the world, peeked at her mother's phone and saw hundreds of messages, some supportive, others filled with anger at the injustice. "Look, Sarah," Lila said, holding up her phone, "these people are all standing with you. You're not alone in this." Sarah managed a small smile, but the anxiety gnawed at her. Returning to school felt daunting. Lila and Mark assured her they would walk her to her classroom and stay until she felt comfortable. As they approached the school gates, a surprising sight awaited them. A group of parents, students, and community members holding signs with messages like "Justice for Sarah" and "End racism in our schools." The crowd parted to let Sarah and her parents through, many offering encouraging words. One woman knelt to Sarah's level, her voice kind but firm. "You're so brave, Sarah. Don't ever let anyone dim your light." Sarah's eyes glistened with tears, but for the first time since the incident, they were tears of hope. When Sarah entered room 6B, she was greeted by a completely different atmosphere. Her desk was adorned with colorful notes and drawings from her classmates. One read, "Your hair is beautiful." Another simply said, "We're sorry for what happened." Many of the students wore headscarves, wigs, or hats in solidarity. Even shy Mia had tied a bright scarf around her head, her cheeks pink with nervousness but her resolve clear. What is all this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Lucas, the class clown, stepped forward, uncharacteristically serious. "We wanted to show you we've got your back, Sarah. What happened wasn't okay, and we're not going to pretend it was." Sarah's heart swelled with gratitude. For the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of belonging, a reminder that not everyone around her was complicit in the cruelty she'd endured. The atmosphere shifted when Claudia entered the room. Her usual air of authority was met with icy stares and a silence that felt anything but respectful. She paused in the doorway, her eyes scanning the transformed classroom, Her lips pressed into a thin line as she took in the posters, the solidarity scarves, and the students who no longer cowered before her. "Take your seats," she barked, her voice sharper than usual. The students obeyed, but their defiance was clear in their stiff postures and unwavering gazes. Claudia's irritation simmered beneath the surface as she began her lesson, her words mechanical and rushed. As she wrote on the board, whispers spread through the room. A folded note made its way across desks, finally landing in Sarah's hands. She opened it to find a single sentence scrawled in bold letters. "We're with you." Outside the school, the rally was gaining traction. What had started as a small gathering of parents had grown into a full-blown protest. Local news crews arrived to cover the event, interviewing parents, students, and activists. A former student, now in her 20s, approached Lila with a story of her own. "Claudia humiliated me, too," she said, her voice shaking. "I was too scared to speak up back then, but seeing this has given me courage. I want to help." The crowd chanted slogans, their voices echoing through the town. No more silence. No more hate. The noise reached the principal's office, where Carter sat nervously, peering through the blinds. The pressure was mounting, and he knew the school's reputation was at stake. By lunchtime, the rally had spilled into the surrounding streets. Students who were too young to join stood at the windows, watching the spectacle with wide eyes. For many, it was their first glimpse of collective action, a powerful lesson in standing up for what's right. Inside the classroom, Claudia struggled to maintain control. The students were restless, their allegiance clearly with Sarah. When Lucas raised his hand to ask a pointed question about discrimination, Claudia's composure cracked. "This is not the time or place for such discussions," she snapped, her voice rising. Lucas didn't back down. "If not now, then when? What you did was wrong, and everyone knows it." The room erupted into murmurs of agreement. Claudia's face turned crimson as she struggled to regain control, her authority slipping through her fingers like sand. By the end of the day, Principal Carter could no longer ignore the outcry. The school board had convened an emergency meeting, and reporters were camped outside the gates. Inside, tensions reached a boiling point as Carter summoned Claudia to his office. "This is spiraling out of control," Carter said, his voice tight with frustration. "We need to contain this before it gets worse." Claudia crossed her arms, her tone defensive. "I was enforcing discipline. This whole thing has been blown out of proportion." "Blown out of proportion?" Carter's voice rose, his usual calm replaced by exasperation. "There are hundreds of people outside calling for your resignation. Do you think this is a coincidence?" Claudia's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. Carter sighed, rubbing his temples. "You're being placed on administrative leave effective immediately. An investigation will determine the next steps." Claudia opened her mouth to protest, but Carter raised a hand to silence her. "This isn't up for debate. Go home, Claudia, and stay out of sight." That evening, Sarah sat with her parents as they watched footage of the rally on the news. She saw familiar faces, her classmates, their parents, even neighbors she barely knew, all standing up for her. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Lila knelt beside her, brushing a hand through her uneven hair. "You've started something big, Sarah. You're showing people that they can stand up to injustice, no matter how young they are." Sarah smiled softly. "I just want this to stop. For everyone. And it will," Mark said, his voice full of conviction. "Because people like you are brave enough to demand it." The Johnsons knew the fight wasn't over, but they also knew they weren't alone. The community had rallied behind them, and the tide was turning. The day after Claudia was placed on administrative leave, the Johnson household became the epicenter of a movement that had taken on a life of its own. Calls poured in from local activists, journalists, and even lawyers offering their services. The community was no longer just rallying for Sarah. It was demanding an overhaul of the school's approach to diversity and justice. Lila sat at the kitchen table, her laptop open to dozens of emails from supporters. Across from her, Mark scrolled through his phone, occasionally pausing to share updates. "Look at this," he said, turning the screen to Lila. It was a post from a civil rights organization that had shared Sarah's story. "They want to use this as a case study for systemic racism in schools," Lila exhaled deeply. This is bigger than us, Mark. It's bigger than Sarah. We have to see this through. In the next room, Sarah was on a video call with her best friend, Mia. You should have seen Lucas today, Mia said, her grin breaking the tension. He told the substitute teacher that he's allergic to injustice. The whole class laughed. Sarah giggled for the first time in days, her spirit slowly beginning to heal. The school board called an emergency town hall to address the growing unrest. The auditorium was packed to capacity, with parents, students, teachers, and community members spilling into the hallways. Cameras from local news outlets lined the back wall, capturing every word for the evening broadcast. Principal Carter sat on stage with the school board members, his normally composed demeanor visibly strained. Claudia was absent, but her name was on everyone's lips. Lila was the first to speak. Standing at the microphone, her voice rang out with controlled anger. 2 days ago, my daughter's dignity was stripped away by someone who was supposed to nurture and protect her. But this isn't just about Sarah. This is about every child who has been silenced, every parent who has been ignored, and every institution that thinks it can sweep injustice under the rug. The crowd erupted into applause. Lila continued, her voice gaining strength. This school has a responsibility to every child, no matter their race, their background, or their hairstyle. And until that responsibility is met, we won't stop. Other parents followed, sharing stories of their own children's experiences with bias and neglect. One mother spoke through tears about her son being punished disproportionately, while another recounted how her daughter had been ignored by teachers in favor of her white classmates. When it was time for the school board to respond, their attempts to placate the crowd with promises of re-evaluating policies fell flat. The crowd demanded action, and the tension in the room reached a boiling point. Just as the meeting was about to conclude, a man in his late 20s stood up in the back. His voice cut through the murmurs. My name is Jacob Williams, and I was once a student at Westfield Elementary. Gasps rippled through the room. The name Jacob Williams was familiar to some, but had been largely forgotten until now. Jacob walked to the microphone, his posture steady but his voice trembling with emotion. When I was a student here, I was the target of the same teacher who hurt Sarah, he began. Ms. Hensley singled me out, mocked me, and made me feel like I didn't belong. My family filed a complaint, but it disappeared. We were told to let it go, for the sake of my future. He paused, scanning the room. I let it go, but now, I realized that silence only allowed her to continue hurting others. Sarah's courage inspired me to speak out. This isn't just about one teacher. It's about a system that protects people like her instead of protecting the students they harm. The room was silent as Jacob stepped down. His revelation was the spark that set the room ablaze. The crowd roared with renewed energy, demanding answers from the school board about the suppressed complaint. The media quickly picked up Jacob's story, and the pressure on the school board intensified. Claudia, now facing both public and legal scrutiny, barricaded herself in her modest home. She refused interviews, claiming she was the victim of a witch hunt. But her past actions were now under a microscope. Through an anonymous tip, reporters uncovered emails between Claudia and Principal Carter, revealing that he had intervened to suppress complaints against her over the years. The emails painted a damning picture of a school culture that prioritized reputation over accountability. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community. Protesters redirected their focus to Principal Carter, demanding his resignation alongside Claudia's dismissal. As the storm raged around her, Sarah found solace in the support of her peers and community. Her story had grown far beyond her, becoming a catalyst for change. She began to see herself not as a victim, but as a fighter. One evening, Sarah and her parents were invited to a community gathering organized by local activists. When Sarah entered the room, she was met with a standing ovation. Tears welled in her eyes as she realized the magnitude of what she had sparked. She was invited to speak, and though nervous, she stepped up to the microphone. I didn't ask for this to happen, she began, her voice soft but steady. But now that it has, I want to make sure it never happens to anyone else. Her words ignited the room. The crowd cheered, chanting her name as she stepped down. Sarah's bravery became a beacon of hope for others who had faced discrimination in silence. By the end of the week, the school board announced sweeping changes. Claudia's termination was made official, and Principal Carter was placed on indefinite leave pending investigation. A third-party review was commissioned to examine the school's handling of discrimination cases, and new policies were promised to ensure accountability and inclusivity moving forward. For the first time in years, the students of Westfield Elementary felt seen and heard. And for Sarah, what had started as a nightmare was transforming into a journey of empowerment. Lila and Mark were perplexed by the anonymous letter. Determined to uncover the truth, they began digging into Claudia's history. Through community whispers and a few bold conversations, they learned that this wasn't the first time the teacher's actions had been questioned. 10 years prior, Claudia had been accused of unfairly targeting another student of color, though the case had mysteriously been dropped. Lila contacted an old teacher, Mrs. Evelyn Marks, who had worked alongside Claudia during the previous incident. Evelyn reluctantly agreed to meet, her voice heavy with regret. "That poor boy," Evelyn began, her hands trembling. "His name was Jacob. He was bright, ambitious, but Claudia didn't like that. She made his life miserable, always singling him out. Then one day, he disappeared from school." When pressed, Evelyn revealed that the boy's family had filed a complaint, but it had been buried by Principal Carter to protect the school's reputation. The Johnsons now realized they weren't just fighting for Sarah, they were up against a pattern of systemic injustice. Word of the suppressed scandal spread quickly. Community members began sharing their own stories of bias and discrimination at Westfield Elementary. A group of parents formed an advocacy committee, demanding the school board take action. Meanwhile, Sarah found strength in the support around her. With her parents' encouragement, she gave a heartfelt interview to the local news, sharing how the incident had affected her. Her bravery resonated with viewers, sparking a larger conversation about racism in schools. Social media campaigns like #StandWithSarah and #InSchoolRacism went viral, drawing national attention. Activists, journalists, and even celebrities began rallying behind the cause, putting immense pressure on the school board to act decisively. A town hall meeting was called to address the growing unrest. The auditorium overflowed with parents, students, and reporters. Principal Carter and Claudia sat at the front, their faces pale under the scrutiny of the crowd. Lila took the microphone, her voice steady but impassioned. "We trusted this school to protect and nurture our children, not to strip them of their dignity. How many more Saras and Jacobs have to suffer before something changes?" The crowd erupted in applause. Other parents stepped forward, sharing their own experiences of bias and negligence. Claudia's attempts to defend herself were met with boos, and Principal Carter's excuses fell flat. The breaking point came when Evelyn Marks, now emboldened, revealed the details of Jacob's case. She presented emails and documents showing that Claudia had been warned repeatedly about her behavior but had faced no real consequences. As the meeting neared its conclusion, a young man in his mid-20s stood up. He introduced himself as Jacob Williams, the boy who had been targeted years ago. Gasps filled the room. Jacob recounted his story with poise, describing how the harassment had forced his family to relocate and how it had taken him years to rebuild his confidence. But seeing Sarah's courage, Jacob said, his voice breaking, "I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. No child should ever feel like they don't belong because of the color of their skin." His presence was a bombshell. The crowd demanded immediate action, leaving the school board with no choice but to terminate Claudia's employment and place Principal Carter under investigation. With Claudia gone and Carter on the verge of resignation, the school board implemented sweeping reforms. Diversity training became mandatory for all staff, and the committee was formed to address systemic inequities in the district. Sarah's resilience became an inspiration. She was invited to speak at community events and even received a scholarship for a prestigious summer program for young leaders. Her parents beamed with pride as they watched their daughter transform her pain into purpose. Jacob, too, found closure. He began mentoring students, using his story to empower others facing discrimination. Months later, Sarah walked into her classroom with her head held high. Her friends greeted her with smiles, and the room was abuzz with excitement for the new school year. The teacher who replaced Claudia, Ms. Rivera, fostered an environment of respect and inclusivity, ensuring that every student felt valued. At home, Sarah kept a framed photo of the posters her classmates had made for her, a reminder of the strength that comes from standing together. As the town of San Rafael moved forward, it carried the lessons of Sarah's story, proving that even in the face of deep injustice, change is possible when a community unites.